Thank you.
So we thought we would do things a little bit differently than you guys might have seen before. Stephanie and I have gotten to know each other pretty well. We met in my now hometown of Wilmington, North Carolina last summer when she came to give a keynote speech and to speak and be on a few panels at a Writers Week that we were doing there. And we had such a fun time, talking to each other and all that kind of stuff earlier today that we decided that we would kind of do this. Instead of one of us going and the other person going, we would kind of do it in a conversational style and kind of ask each other questions, then open it up to you guys for questions. So, one thing that we talked about starting with, Stephanie has a kind of interesting path to becoming a writer, and I think is illustrative of some of the challenges that all writers face in terms of how to support themselves and try to, follow their passion and create their art. So, Stephanie, do you want to start by telling us a little bit of your story?
Sure, I'd love to. One of the reasons I think that this is such an important question is there's so many people who don't see themselves as writers, who don't have any models for being writers, who've never met a writer, someone who's writing other than in a journal, that kind of thing, and they don't know that that's a possibility for themselves. And so I really like to say, here's where I come from, and it is not the path that you would think that would ever bring you to the writing world. And so I'd like to talk about that a little bit. I'm from rural North Carolina. I'm from a town called Lenoir, North Carolina. Does anybody know Lenoir? Oh my gosh, there's even more people. That's amazing. That's great. It's a small town in the western part of the state. It's known for furniture manufacturing, and that's what my father did up until the last couple of years, and when he retired. But that's what he did for 40 years, is work in the furniture factory. And so my mother became a Jehovah's Witness, and I have 4 younger brothers, by the way. And so that was the path that she took, and also the path that the rest of us, her children, took. And so being a Jehovah's Witness is in some ways incompatible with a kind of worldly-looking faith. And so being a writer was not something that was encouraged. And also, we didn't have any money, So coming from a place where you don't have money and you don't have that kind of encouragement that this is something that's possible and open to you. And so I didn't for a while, and I didn't go to college after high school immediately. I went a couple years later when I just couldn't stand it anymore, and I just really wanted to be a part of that world. And I decided that if I could find a profession that would allow me to work and take care of myself and maybe help my brothers in particular, that I would follow that profession. And so I decided to get a PhD and try to become an academic, and then that way, if the writing part of my life failed miserably, then I could fall back on that. So that's what I did. I mean, that's the Reader's Digest version, but that's it.
With a few kind of tangents into accounting, I think you said.
That's right. That's right. That was my first profession, my first insane profession. Insane for me.
Right.
Yeah. And what about you? You were talking.
Again, I think mine is fairly unorthodox looking back at it. Although I was just I think life is just strange in the way it works out. I think that I was always a storyteller. I mean, my mom tells stories how I would just follow her around the house, telling her these stories I made up, and they would be everything from why my GI Joes were so small compared to normal people, like how they shrunk to that size. Or why my toy Triceratops how he'd acquired a rocket launcher, or wings, or whatever, And she actually tells this story that she would lock herself in the laundry room or the bathroom to get away from me for just a little while, and that I would crouch down and start telling her story, keep telling her stories underneath the door.
Every mother in here understands that story.
What's funny now is I've realized that even in the last year, I've been home and been stuck on a manuscript and talked to my mom about it nonstop for like 45 minutes, following her around the house. So I guess you don't ever go out of someplace.
That's right.
She takes it a little more seriously now, though, so that's kind of cool. But I so I was an English major as an undergraduate, and like you, I thought I was going to do maybe the PhD path, to get a PhD in English and go into academia. And it was only because really it seemed like a way that was part of my interest and that I could potentially, make a living. And so I was going to take the GRE, and but I started right after I graduated. I started working on my first novel, and I wasn't ready to go out into the real world. I wasn't ready to take the GRE yet. So I'd read Hemingway's A Movable Feast, about his time in 1920s Paris, and I was like, where can I find that I can go that it's kind of like I can replicate that? And so I know this is an overly probably romantic, idea, but I sold my car and I just moved to Argentina, to Buenos Aires, and it actually turned out pretty well. I mean, at that time for what I was trying to do, I taught English as a second language, got my certificate to do that, and kept working on my novel, and then I ran out of money, and I got a job in San Francisco that was really, in the business world, .com kind of, but it was after the big, bubble of all that. So it was somewhere between kind of .com-ish and corporate, and I did that for years and just wrote before work, after work, during lunch, just whenever I could, and finally over time, finally started to get some stuff published, and have been able to put a lot more into the writing,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, can we talk about where your stories come from? Can we talk about creating a story that might become a larger story, and when you know that, because
Right.
he has a novel coming out next month, by the way, and so you've done this a couple times.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, so Stephanie and I were talking, even when we were emailing before all of this, about, what we want to talk about and kind of where our stories come from. And for me, and I haven't set out to do this, this was not a planned thing, but now all three of my novels, including the one that comes out next month, all started with a short story, which I think is kind of neat to think about, because writing a book, even when you've done it a few times, I mean, I don't know about you, but the thought of another one when I finish one is just scary. Like
Yes.
starting this whole, it's hugely intimidating. It's like, building a pyramid. But when you start to take it a chunk at a time and start with a short story, I think that makes it much more manageable. So for me, my first novel, Fallen Land, actually started with a short story that I wrote that was based on an old ballad that I just had stuck with me. It's an old ballad called When First Unto This Country, and it has its origins in Ireland over 200 years ago. Mm-hmm. And like the first lines are found in ballads over 200 years ago. And so I wrote this short story about this Irish immigrant, orphan. He's 13 or 14 years old. He's a horse thief. He's escaped from a number of orphanages and foster homes, and is kind of living on his own. And he falls in with these bandits during the Civil War. And at the end of that short story, it had this hanging ending. Quite literally, his prospects didn't look good. And so I thought I'd just written the short story and I was done with it. And it just haunted me, I guess, is the best word. I mean, 2 months later, I found myself, I was just still thinking about him, and I felt kind of bad, like I'd left this almost kid that was like a kid brother age to me, I'd left him hanging. And so I just, that I remember because it was the morning of my 27th birthday, I got up and I just started writing. After that, I just made that the first chapter and just kept writing the book. And I said, I'm going to see if I can get him out of this mess, and then what happens next. Mm-hmm. And it was as simple as that, and the book just gathered steam, from there.
Oh, yeah.
And then The River of Kings, my novel that came out in 2017, started with this trip that I took down this river where I grew up. This river called the Altamaha, that they call the Little Amazon, or the Amazon of the South. And it's about 20 minutes, the mouth of it's about 20 minutes from where I grew up. But it's only 137 miles long, or it is 137 miles long. It's undammed. It's the second largest contributor of fresh water to the Atlantic in North America, and the Nature Conservancy has called it one of the last 75 great places. It's home to all these rare and endangered species, and it even is rumored to harbor its own sea monster, the Altamaha, which is kind of like Nessie from the Loch Ness. And I took a kayak trip in college with a couple buddies, and we stopped the second day of the trip just to eat lunch, and we were at a part of the river that Just no one lives around, no civilization, no towns. So we didn't expect to find this path, this trail into the woods. So we started following this trail, and we came across this gar that had been, alligator gar that had been left in the middle of the trail and gutted. And I don't know if you guys know what a gar looks like, an alligator gar, but it's basically a dinosaur. It's a living fossil, covered in armor and everything. Just laid across the trail like a warning. And we were like, 19, 20 years old, so, didn't quite learn that we weren't invisible yet. So we keep walking, and we come to these two saplings that have been tied into like an arbor over the trail. And I have pictures of this. I'm not making this up. Small skulls were dangling from it of small animals and fish on lengths of fishing line. So we keep going. And we found this shed out in the woods where we, that we ended up, had a burlap flap for a door, tin roof, and we pulled open that burlap flap and jumped inside. And probably not the smartest thing, and luckily it was empty. But it's always been this mystery what was going on out there. And there's a lot of history of poaching, and this book has a big environmental slant, and that was all big in my mind. And I went back about 10 years later to try to find that place with a couple of my buddies that were on that trip. And we could never find it again. We didn't have GPS at the time and all that stuff. Now my friends would hit a button on their watch and know where it was. But that really started, the short story that led to the whole novel. So it's kind of as small as that in some ways. Mm-hmm. What about you? With, how do you know when it's going to become just a short story or novel, and what kind of things? We've talked about nuggets. You and I both have used that word. If you want to expound on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that I know, but sometimes you get this notion that there's something more that you need to say about and sometimes that means that the short story's not done, I mean, sometimes it's something as simple as that, but sometimes it means that there's a bigger story that you need to explore, or that the short story needs to go in a different direction. And so I've had a couple of those. One of the things that I was mentioning earlier, there was a moment. I was at a conference in Atlanta. I was at the American Library Association conference, and it's huge. It's lots of people there, and I went into the women's restroom, and I was washing my hands, and there's a big mirror, so I can see everything behind me. And so there are two African American women who were cleaning in the bathroom. They're middle-aged women cleaning, and so the bathroom is packed. People lined up out the door, and so a white woman comes out of one of the stalls, and she says to one of the black women who's there cleaning, she says, "Thank you for the work that you're doing." Mm-hmm. And so the black woman does not acknowledge her. She doesn't say anything at all. She doesn't nod, And so I'm in the mirror, kind of watching this story, this moment kind of play out. And it really surprised me. It challenged me in all kinds of ways, because I'm thinking, why didn't she acknowledge the woman? She doesn't have to acknowledge her, but it just felt like a very strange moment that could be this collision. And a lot of my stories are these kinds of collisions of class and race and gender, and so I thought, is this one of those moments? And I've been trying to tease that out and figure out, is this a short story, or is this a bigger kind of enterprise, for it? And I have had stories that have grown into short stories that are based on kind of anecdotal moments, like that. Like your story is this kind of adventure moment, and you could see all kinds of possibilities for it. Right. But sometimes they're just images, which I know you have too, right? That you see something and you think, oh, that can be a story. Right. And I thought in Lenore, there's this. There used to be a hotel where black women went to see the gynecologist. And so this is up until the last, I don't know, maybe 35 years. And so the people who saw the women were called black doctors by people in the African American community, although they were not African American. They were white men who would see African American women. And so it was called the Carlheim, and women would go to the hotel to see the doctor. some of the experiences were banal and easy and mundane, but some of them, as you might imagine, were not.
Right.
And the women were not treated with the respect that they deserved. And so, you know, you're at the doctor, it's already awful.
Right.
You know, you're already, you know, you don't have clothes on, you know, it's already awful.
Yeah.
So, you know, so then, you know, to be in a position where you feel like I don't have, you know, I'm not being treated with respect, or I'm being treated with disdain, or that kind of thing. And so I thought that was my novel, but it turns out that it's like 2 pages of my novel. You know, so you know, sometimes there's an image or a moment that you know is important to you, but you don't know how big it's going to be.
Right.
You know? Yeah.
I think sometimes you don't know, like, is it going to run out of fuel or steam, or does it keep going? Does it just grow and grow? And sometimes you don't know until you write it.
That's right.
Until you really get pretty far along, which is
Yeah.
scary and also exciting, I think, right?
Yeah, yeah. And I feel like that until I know the character in some really significant and meaningful way, I don't know what, you know, what the desire is that's going to fuel it.
Right.
You know, and so then that helps me kind of figure out what I've got on my hands.
Right.
You know? Yeah.
We both, you know, some novelists also write short stories, and,
Yeah.
and some don't. I have friends that are novelists that cannot stand short stories, but we both, you know, write a lot of stories. Do you sometimes, do you enjoy one versus the other, or how do you know, do you enjoy one form, or what? How does that work?
Oh, I love them both. I love a short story, though. I mean, it's, you know, it's the thing that you are taught in school, you know,
Yep.
and mostly because of convenience,
Right.
you know, because it's much easier to try to write 10 pages than it is to try to write 300,
Right.
you know.
Yep.
And so, so it's kind of your first love. And so I really do love the short story form. And I also think that there's so much in the world of the short story, you know, and if it's working, it's this kind of reflecting orb, you know, that doesn't necessarily always connect, but always reflects in something else in the narrative. So, so I'm really a big fan of them. I maybe because I just finished a novel, I kind of am in novel mode. Is that how
Right.
you feel?
Yeah,
You know?
I feel like I get into one mode or another, but I still, like you, I think my first love is still the short story, and I find, and sometimes it's hard because, you know, you get pushed, you got usually deadlines and bigger contracts come with
Yeah.
the novels, and it can feel like, oh, the short story is somehow like less important, and so sometimes, you know, I have to make sure to put in the time, but yeah, it's still kind of like my first love, and I've found ways, definitely in things I've been working on, to kind of, you know, novels and stories and doing things like that, so that I get to kind of work on that level
I
a
know.
little bit more,
Yeah.
you know.
Well, what about process? How do you get it done? You know, especially when you're kind of juggling
Juggling a
and
lot.
then you're on deadline.
Yeah, so I have a kind of, I have a very, I have a system, I would say. You know, I have a regimen kind of that, this probably sounds a little crazy, but what I do, and I've done this for a while in order to compartmentalize, is the stuff that I do, what I do in work is what I call non-writing work. I do that from about, you know, in the morning, 8, 9 a.m. until 3, and then I take a nap, and I get up, and I take a shower, and I change my clothes to a completely different set of clothes, and it's like I start my day all over again. It's like 2 days in one day. And then I go to the cafe where I write, and I sit at the same spot, at the same cafe, order the same things, the same time of day. I now have earned a plaque at the main cafe I go to, which tells people in no uncertain terms, I did not put it up, but it says, well, I'll let you guys, you know, it has the acronym GTFU on it, if you guys want to think about what that might mean. Although I think people seem to sit at it more now that they put it up. I'm not sure it's good. But you know, I go to the same spot, but I've always believed in that. You know, Faulkner said this line that has always stuck with me. He said, I only write when inspiration strikes. Luckily, it strikes at 9 a.m. sharp every morning. And, you know, to me, I interpreted that is he shows up, he puts himself there every morning, and when you do that, good things happen, you know? And I also think the cues of the same time of day, at least for me, works really well. So I'm not, if I just wrote when I felt inspired, I would just be waiting around, I feel like. And if I put myself there, you know, in a kind of very workmanlike way almost, then that like sets the stage for kind of that little bit of mystery and magic that you're kind of always courting and hoping will happen, and that, you know, it will gather steam and good things will happen. So that's the way I kind of do it. But I've been accused, you know, I've had like people come up to me at the cafe and be like, so are you like a OCD or something? You park in I park in the same spot and everything. And I was like, I don't think so, but it seems to work. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I do that when I can. I
Yeah.
do really love to have a schedule and a routine, but I try to write a little something every day, only because especially during the year, I teach at Lehigh University. Does anybody know that in Bethlehem, PA? Oh wow, yeah. So yeah, that's where I teach, and so during the school year, it's a madhouse and crazy,
Right.
and and so there are lots of things going on, and
Right.
so it's hard to maintain a schedule that way, but I do try to get something done every day so I can feel like I'm still writing.
I feel the same way. If I at least I get a little bit, even if something comes up and I can't, it's like if I get just something out, I feel so much better about that day. Like I've done what I was like meant to do, not just all my other things that seem almost like chores to keep my life together.
Me too, me too. And you forget about the thread of your thought if you let it go.
Yeah.
And sometimes you forget why you even liked the idea in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
Like,
you start writing and you think, it seemed so good 2 weeks ago, and now it's nothing.
They can go cold. It's
Yes,
like
they
you got to
can.
strike while the iron is hot, or whatever they say.
Yeah.
I think it's like that.
Yeah, I do too. So we would love to answer questions or talk about things or from you guys. Yes.
Really for both of you, Kevin, you mentioned until you get to know your character. So I just wondered how to get to know your characters by writing, and then go on to do that with your links, or do they come alive in your mind, or do you see somebody and think, oh, I'm going to take that out of that person? How do you do that?
The question is, how do you get to know your characters? Is that characterized okay? And what you said about writing your way into a knowledge of your character. And this is a thing that I tell my students all the time, and we're trying to figure out how to get started, and how to get the character to live. Is that you would never presume that you knew someone if you met them once. Or if you had a couple of evenings and you went to a couple of movies, you would never presume to know that person. And so knowing a character is kind of the same way. You kind of have to live with them a little while, understand what their motivations are, understand what they would do and what they wouldn't do, and then you can know what they really want. And that's what's going to make the story live if it does. Because if you get kind of at the surface of what someone wants, like we are so, as human beings, and certainly our characters too, we are such a big mass of contradictory desires and loves and feelings. And so that's at the surface, but underneath there's something that's really vitally important to us, that's driving our decisions, small and large. And so if you can get at least to a little bit of that, then you can get to know the character and know how the character will proceed. And then what happens with the character is really already foretold, because you know who that character is and what the character will do. So it is a process of getting to know them, writing, thinking through it. Some people keep journals. I have with characters. Sometimes I like to just keep like image journals, where I see the character doing this, I see the character doing that. The character is involved in this thing. What if the character met this other person? Just so I can understand who the person is. And some of that stuff I'll never use. I'll never use in a literal manuscript. But it's really important, and it's not wasted. It's still valuable to me in the final product of the story.
And I would say, when I have very much the same answer as Stephanie for that. But one thing that ends up being really big for me when I really tend to have this spark where I get deeper with the characters when they surprise me. Because I think sometimes I start with it's like you said, that's such a good metaphor when you meet someone in real life, and you kind of you form this idea about what they are based on all kinds of things, what they do for a living and where they're from and what they're wearing, you know what I mean? And then when you really get to know them and know who they are and they surprise you, and there's something about that moment of surprise when I'm working on a character where 2 weeks ago, I think he or she would have done this, and then I know in this moment that this is what they would do, and I'm like, bam, that's it.
Right.
That's the meat of it. That's where their heart came out, or their fear, or that's something that I didn't realize, or I knew but I didn't know,
Right.
or they didn't know until that moment, and then that's like the spark where you get it. And until that moment, sometimes I think it can be a little bit, they can be a little too generic or surface level, like you have not really gotten into the meat of that character yet. And sometimes, it takes a few of those before you really, get rolling, but you're just discovering, that's to me is it's one of the most exciting parts is like when I feel like I find something out about that character, I mean, it just feels so, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that, but, it is, it's big, to me, I guess, and exciting. And so, yeah, I would add that to it.
Yes.
I was wondering if each one of you might be kind of prepared to read part of your around the table.
The comment is, did we bring these as decoration?
Yeah.
Or are we actually going to read them? Well, I mean, I think we would both be happy to do that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to? All right, sure. I'll read a little bit from, all right, to give you guys a little of the setting for the book. It's about two brothers who are delivering their father's ashes down the Altamaha River. He was a shrimper. He died under mysterious circumstances. And as they're going down the river, they're trying to kind of unravel the mystery of his death. And I'm just going to read to you guys a little bit from, this is their first day on the river. Soon the trees are all there is, a kingdom of cypress and tupelo, of water oak and river birch and black willow from which moccasins might hang like scaled question marks. Roads will cross the river only twice, and ancient swamps and sloughs and oxbows insulate its snaking path from the high ground of men. People call it the Little Amazon. Their father was born on this river, in one of the shanty boats that float on the water like flood-born houses. River raised, he worked at sea, a shrimper, a failed one really by most definitions of success. Probably the old man was biased though, a childhood of river cat and gar, of long days on smooth water that reflected the sky. Those were days of glory. And later, dredging up empty nets for weeks on end, that was anything but. In the end, it was the river that killed him, or something from it. They found his boat first. It was tangled up in a sedge at a kink in the river. He wasn't in it. 2 days later, his body washed up on a mudflat just downriver of the old coastal highway. Hunter was at the ramp when the sheriffs brought him in. They let him unzip the bag. The old man was shirtless, his skin white as something from a horror film. Hunter hadn't realized how much age and time had damaged the old man's tattoos, muddled them. They covered him like old bruises. There was the river assault tattoo from his time in the Brownwater Navy, a devil's head with downturned trident, mark of the Delta Devils, terrors of the Mekong. The insignia lay bleary now upon his shoulder, made as if by a bully's fist. On his left chest, the inscription, "Sat Calm, Death to Communists," tattooed as tribute to the Be It High Sea Commandos who wore it there, a death sentence if they were captured. There were the swooping swallows, one on each shoulder to carry him to heaven if he died at sea, and the North Star to help him find his way home, its points dulled now over his heart. All these signs and wonders inked upon his skin, symbols of power and luck, and a new one among them they couldn't stop. Square in his chest was a depression, a sunken wound the size of a man's fist, the color of storm. Burst veins fractured it, jagged and red. Hunter touched 2 fingers to the place, his father's heart softer now than it had ever been, broken. Sturgeon strike, they said. It was September, and the sturgeon had jumped all summer. No one knew why they did it, these remainders of prehistory. They inhabited the deepest holes of the river, the lightless benthic regions. clad in a bronze-like armor of bony plates. Brother to the dinosaur, they'd survived cataclysm, extinction, coming upriver for eons in spring to spawn. In summer, they rested in their dark places, watery caverns protected from the river's pull. In fall, they returned to the sea. Near the interstate bridge lay a 90-foot hole where one of the real leviathans were rumored to gather, armored and silent like a fleet of submarines. Fishes a century old, some of them, weighing 700 pounds. In June, without fail, they started jumping. God help him who was running 30 knots when one of the beasts torqued itself from the water, its bone shield bright and deadly in the sunlight. Artillery, that's what the old-timers called it. Some said they did it for joy, others, reasons darker. They said it was a defense mechanism, an evolutionary protection against humans, against their boats and dams, their wastewater discharge and industrial runoff, the only weapon for a fish with no teeth. Some wanted them eradicated, finish what the world-killing meteor couldn't, what the caviar craze of the late 1800s almost did. No more prehistoric beasts, no more broken limbs, shattered faces, collapsed lungs. Kill them off. Convenience, revenge. Legend had the great monster of the river living among them, the Altamaha, a survivor of the Mesozoic era, a cryptid of the first order, at least 20 feet in length and black, with the toothed snout of a crocodile, the bony plate armor of a sturgeon or gar. A creature trapped here, perhaps, when the prehistoric seas receded. Probably just a line of sturgeons surfacing, only that. But their father believed it's something more. He believed the stories of the old-time timbermen who described a thing darker, more sinister. Hunter looks at the trees along the riverbanks. There's hardly any of that old-growth timber left now. A few ancient survivors posing for photographs. A centuries-old myth trolling the waters they once guarded.
My book, this is my novel. The paperback just came out on the 6th, and it was done by the same artist, the cover that did Michelle Obama's official portrait. Doesn't it look like it? As soon as the portrait came out, we said, oh, that's our cover. She did this cover too. This was released on February 6th, and so they're both Amy Sherald. I think she's really brilliant. So I just want to read a couple of pages from a story called Unassigned Territory. And this is a story that, as we were talking about, was based in the loosest way on an event that happened to me. I was in Prague in the Czech Republic a few years ago, and there were these witnesses at the top of a subway station, and they were doing something called street witnessing. And street witnessing is something that I never did when I was a witness because I lived in rural North Carolina and there was no need to stand on the street because there was nobody coming. So, that was not something that I ever took part in, but I know a lot of people in cities, do. And so when I saw them there, they were frantically trying to give out watchtowers and awakes to people as they pass by. And of course, they wanted to engage people in conversation if they could. But, people were walking away and kind of, going around trying to avoid them. And there was something about that moment. I had not been out in field service is what it's called. I had not done that in several years at that time. But just the I don't know, it just hit me in this particular way. I felt so emotional about it. I speak no Czech, and they didn't speak English, and so I was trying to say, trying to mime somehow that I knew what they were doing, and that I'd been one, but that didn't work out. And so I started writing a story, and so this is a story that came from it. And I did want to say, too, that my mother and my brother are both still Jehovah's Witnesses. And so one of the last things that I want to do as a writer is to make people feel unworthy or to hurt them. And I'm Southern, I'm an African American woman. There are lots of things that get written about any of those groups that are not complimentary and that often assume lots of things about the group that you come from. So I'm really cognizant of that. I don't want to shy away from what I feel like is the truth of the character or the situation, but I also don't want to make them be easy targets for shame or ridicule. Leslie Pawlowski parks her blue Horizon on the shoulder of the dirt road, the best shade we can find. July is a killer in North Carolina. It's always hot as blazes, hot enough for you, hot enough to fry eggs, and on and on. We are in the thick of it. Mid-morning, our dresses clinging to our backs, way far in the middle of nowhere, preaching door to door, working in our congregation's unassigned territory. This is the kind of dirt road, hee-haw, overalls, straw-in-the-teeth place even we Southerners make fun of. Pikes and Wagner's country. Did you hear the one about the Pike girl who went to a town doctor? The doctor says to her mother, "Ma'am, has this girl had intercourse?" And the mother, hands wringing, says, "I don't rightly know, doctor, but if she needs it, you make sure you give it to her." The passenger's side window sticks in the middle of going up or down. It's a piece of junk car. And on the way to every door, we shed bits of polyfoam from the car's cracked upholstery. Leslie has a great attitude about her poverty. Halcyon salad days she will remember with a withering chuckle when her future kids complain of their own first cars. We've visited too many houses without updating our field service records, and we stop before we forget the details. We need to keep records for ourselves, for the congregation file on the territory, and for the official log we store at the Kingdom Hall. What was that woman's name at the blue trailer, Steph? I shuffle through my notebooks knowing I won't find anything useful. You're supposed to write things like Ruth Boaz, 123 Main Street, blue trailer, lived in town all her life, no husband in the house, 4 kids, 1 still at home, took the July 1989 awake, making the most of your youth, expressed an interest in tarot, bring the magazine, Why Godly People Shun Spiritism. My records are, to say the least, incomplete. I wrote, trailer is a nightmare. Looks like the time my brother and I played drug czar with an old suitcase and Monopoly money. Ryan threw my clothes and shoes out of the dresser and closet screaming, "Where's a real stash? Where's a real stash?" I'm praying that Leslie won't ask to see what I've written. I've been at this long enough that I don't need any guidance from my field service partner, but sometimes Leslie will say things like, "You're writing a book over there, aren't you?" But she never pries. Shoot, I hate to leave her name off. She was nice too, Leslie sighs. Nice to Leslie means that she didn't cuss us, that she didn't shoo us away or hide behind her curtains with her hand over the mouth of her child like a kidnapper. "But Mama," the kid would manage through her fingers, "there's some girls on the porch." "Shh," I imagine her saying. "Do you want to be saved? Is that what you want?" Thank you. How are we on time? I think
15 minutes.
I think we might have time for a couple more questions if you
Yeah.
have them. Oh, yes.
You're an academic, and I'm fascinated as how can you teach writing?
Oh, boy. Oh, the question is, how can you teach writing? What is that old joke? Very carefully? I don't know. I think that anything that can be learned can be taught. I really do. Can you teach someone how to be Hemingway or Toni Morrison? I doubt it. I mean, I certainly don't think I think that those are kind of lightning strikes anyway, those sorts of folk. But I do think that you can teach writing. I think you can teach the fundamentals. You can teach routine and schedule. You can teach people about the world of writing that they're finding themselves in, so that they understand that they're part of a continuum. Anytime you're doing something that's skill-based and craft-based, you don't just jump out of Zeus's head. You're a part of a long road that got you there. And so I think that learning the history and learning where you are in that journey, and learning style and technique, can be really, really valuable. I don't know that you teach greatness with that. I mean, I think people people walk in with greatness, and you can help them along the way. You teach.
I don't teach. I've taught a couple of, I had a significant experience with this actually in October because I was asked to teach a creative writing class at Pellissippi State Community College in Knoxville, just a one-day class. And I was a little bit worried because I've never taken a formal creative writing class. And I was, so I thought, who am I to teach one that I don't know? And then I was like, well, I'm going to use that as a strength because I don't know how I'm supposed to do this. So I'm just going to basically try to give to them the lessons that I've learned that have been the most important to me, both in a very practical sense and also just what works for me. It might not work for them, but they might be able to take what works for me and figure out how, something that works for them. And I also found, so they wanted me to do a story prompt. And I was like, I don't know how I feel about this because I don't do a story prompt. And then I realized that was just patently untrue. I carry around a little notebook, like you said, and it's kind of an image journal, largely. You use that word, image journal. It's the same thing for me. I see something, sometimes it's a turn of phrase. Lots of the times it's just an image that I put down, and those are prompts. I use those whether it's to start a whole story or it's in the middle of a novel. It's an image that'll come back to me. So I'm using prompts, And so it ended up being great, actually. The experience was really great. So, but that was really my first experience teaching creative writing class versus just speaking to one and talking about my experiences and stuff.
David Sedaris used to have students watch soap operas, and he freely admits that he also, because he wanted to see the soap opera, but there are very few things better than a soap opera than learning how to create suspense, learning how to keep people on the hook, learning how to keep that plot going.
Right.
I mean, so it's not complete pedagogical nonsense,
right. I think too, there's something that I think about a lot too. If you look at even, these great canonical, like Hemingway famously lost all those stories on that train, right? Or it's his wife or someone, left them on the train. And he said it was the greatest thing that happened to him because they were all just derivative stories that had happened first. But if you look at Faulkner's early stuff, there's a lot of kind of derivative things. And I think, so we can call it derivative, or it's kind of learning, the mechanics and the style, the way other people have done it, and like learning the rules, and then you learn how to break them or something. And there are the people that just seem to be able to do that from the very beginning. But also, even with a lot of the greats, I think you look at the early stuff and you see them that they're kind of learning their way through it, and then they go from there, and their own style comes out of that or something, But it's like somehow they were teaching themselves the fundamentals, I think.
Yes.
So I'm not sure this for Taylor. When you're writing dialogue with characters, say in 1864 in, a moonshiner, how do you get confident that the dialogue sounds true to what it would have sounded like? Is that totally creative, or do you do any kind of research?
I definitely do research where I can find it, and the things that help the most with that, depending on the era, it really depends whether there is literature out there that has kind of the vernacular, the way that people would actually speak. I was able to find that for like Civil War era stuff. I was able to find people who were, for instance, kind of like embedded journalists. And while they'll write in a more formal style, when they're talking about where they interviewed someone else, they would kind of write it in this vernacular, and you would get a pretty good idea. And so I think that is part of it, just doing whatever research you can, and trying to also find like words of the time period that were that are not, that were slang of the time, and looking into all that. For this novel, which is largely contemporary but has a whole storyline from the 1560s, revolves around a man named Jacques Lemoyne, who was the first European artist in what would become the United States. It was the French from the 1560s, and I was I had to figure out, and there are small parts of it in French, but I was trying, how they would speak, and I got so lucky with that because I was looking for a French professor to help me after a couple drafts of it. And I was recommended to a guy at UNCW, where I live, University of North Carolina, Wilmington, which is not a big school. And I thought he was just, going to be just French professor and help me with that. Well, it turns out he's one of the foremost scholars on the subject of Fort Caroline and Jock Lemoyne and all that. So on the one hand, I was really excited. On the other hand, I was so scared because I was like, what's this guy with a PhD who's founded his entire career on this going to think about my fictional interpretation? I got his feedback back. It was like 15 minutes before I met my editor for the first time. I was meeting him in Chapel Hill. I was changing my clothes in a gas station parking lot. I come down. I got up at 6 a.m. that morning and drove down from the Virginia Book Festival. And I was in the driveway, and I get this, or in the gas station, behind a gas station where I was changing my clothes. I get this email, and I was like, oh man. And I opened it up, and luckily he loved it. And he had all this stuff like, oh, so saucy, and all this stuff he put in the margins, in the little Microsoft Word, document. And then he ended up being a huge resource for like the slang of the time and all this stuff, so that, Frenchmen saying to each other things like, what soft balls do you have, and things like that were like of that time period, so that really helped, and he's kind of a pretty I love him, and he's one of my good friends now, but he's just fun to see a guy like that that's pretty professional on the outside really get into some of the nitty gritty. I mean, he had such a good time with it. It was fun, so I don't know, you just search hard and you find something somewhere that guides you along, I think. She was asking what novel that was. That was from The River of Kings, the novel that I read from, which has is mainly a contemporary storyline of those two brothers, but weaves in the story of the French colonists at Fort Caroline, which was the first fortified European settlement in what would become the United States, and that many scholars now believe was on the Altamaha River. And it actually has the illustrations from that artist throughout the book, which we were able to have survived. So some of our first illustrations of the native flora and fauna, the Amerindians, all that stuff.
What are your next novels? You both said that you're both working on.
Well, I'm hoping it will be a novel. Right now, it's not quite. It's a story, and it's set in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. There's a character from this novel who is the main character in this story, and she's gotten involved. She's a spiritual person, and she's gotten involved with this religious group in Winston-Salem, and has become a vocal member of the group. She's also become a good friend of a woman who is older than her in the group, and they've been quietly kind of making trouble in the group, and it's because one, they don't have a lot to do. I mean, just literally, and two, it's because they figured out that a way to power, especially if you're a woman, and especially if you're a woman who is not someone of means, that a way to power is through storytelling and through narrative. And so the narratives that they weave around some of the people in their congregation are really biting, and sometimes only shades of truth, but they're powerful. And so they figured out how to create some of that how to get some of that power for themselves. And it's set in Winston-Salem. If you have read about the Salem witch trials, so much of all that trouble started from young women, teenage women, saying, "I saw her in the field and it was late, and she looked like she was doing something she shouldn't have been doing." And you can imagine how if you feel like the lowest person on the totem pole in your community, or that how seductive that might be to have that kind of power. And so that's where this novel, or whatever it is going.
And my next one comes out on March 20th of next month. It's called Gods of Powell Mountain. And interestingly enough, there's two main characters, and one of them her name is Granny May, and she's what they call up in the mountain the Granny Woman. She's a folk healer, but a lot of people talk about her as being a witch or a wood witch. And she's kind of, she deals with this thing because the same people that are very suspicious of her and talk about her behind her back, they still show up, in the middle of the night wanting help, And so, you know, and she's developed a little bit of this bitterness, I think, that she's working through, especially like kind of what she thinks as town people that kind of look down on her, but still will come up the mountain when they you know, need a tincture or a potion or that kind of thing. And then it's really about her relationship with her grandson, who comes back from Korea. He's a Marine in Korea. He's in the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, which is, you know, kind of a Korean War. It's kind of a little bit of, you know, they call it America's Forgotten War. And he's at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, which is this terrible hand-to-hand fighting battle, and he loses part of one of his legs. And he comes home and he's a bootlegger. He can still drive. And so he gets into bootlegging. It's really their relationship and unraveling the mystery of Granny Mae's daughter and his mother's. She's in an insane asylum and was the victim of some real trauma, and they're kind of unraveling the mystery of what really happened to her. And so it's, yeah, set in Western North Carolina in 1952.
You said a minute ago that you had something that was really just a story, but you didn't know if it was going to be a novel, that kind of thing. Could you both talk a little bit, like, how would you define simply a short story versus a novel story?
The question is how to define a short story as opposed to a novel. What's basically the difference between those two forms? And there's not a whole lot of difference. I mean, for the publishing world, it's basically length, how long something is, and those are kind of publishing requirements, that kind of thing. But there's so many novels that do these very experimental things. Do you guys remember Olive Kitteridge a few years ago? That's a really beautiful novel of interconnected stories. You know, and of course, if we think about from the past, Winesburg, Ohio, it was also a very similar kind of novel. So the rules about how you create a story as opposed to a novel are a little bit fluid. But we usually think about Edgar Allan Poe, and he kind of gave us the template for thinking about what a short story is. And he said that the story needs to have a unity of effect. And so the things that are extraneous that we might pursue in thinking about a novel, we don't do with a short story. So you have a small number of characters. You have those characters going after one big goal, and there is a kind of unity of effect for that short story. Now, you could argue that a novel is doing that in some ways, but I think a novel is reaching out into other, that we might think about in a short story as tangential sorts of areas, but the short story is contained in and of itself. And so the short stories that I've started with that I thought might be novels, and even the short story that I started with that I thought might be this novel, there was the kernel of something in that story, and I'll just very briefly, the story that I started with was a true story that was based in a small town in North Carolina. This family had lost their son and their brother because of this freak accident. And the family came to believe, and they had the pastor in their small church also helped them to believe that the son was not dead, that he had not yet crossed over, and that they could pray him back, and that if their faith was strong enough, they could bring him back. And so they set up in the church. They had 24-hour vigils. It was heartbreaking. People were very upset. I've read many newspaper articles about it, and the mother in particular is especially heartbreaking. And you know, you can tell even from what's quoted in the paper that she so wants to believe that she can't quite believe, but she's holding on to this hope because it just seems just so fundamentally unfair. And of course it is, that the 23-year-old would not get to see the progress of the rest of his life because of something that happened in a minute. And she said if God could just give her back that minute, you know. And so I started writing that story. This was a white family that this happened to, but I started writing it from the points of view of an African-American family a little bit later in time. not much later, I mean like 5 years, but a little bit later in time, set in a larger place. And the story it just did not come together for me. And I couldn't get it to work. It felt, and there was something about it I didn't understand, or it just wasn't true to me. And so it wasn't until I moved the story, said it many years later, 17 years later, when I realized that the story that I wanted to tell, or that I felt like I needed to tell, was about how you can deal with grief. You know, what's the aftermath of your life like? Once the unspeakable has happened, then how does your life look? And that's the thing that I was really honed into. Another writer might have jumped in at other places, but that's the story that I wanted to tell, and it took me a while to figure that out.
Yeah, I would add that, you know, for me, the difference, sometimes it just something feels like a short story or a novel, but I recently had something I thought was going to be longer and turned out really short. And, you know, it was actually right after Charlottesville in last August. And I, you know, had all of this anger and anxiety, and it really rocked. Charlottesville just rocked me personally on a level I didn't really respect, and didn't really expect. And I had to write about it. I just felt, I was just full up. It's the only thing I knew how to do. And when it happened, I found myself thinking about these stories that I had been told by a friend of mine who grew up in Logan County, West Virginia, which is where the Battle of Blair Mountain happened, where all of these miners rose up. And it was not just white miners, it was African Americans and Italians and Poles all rose up against big coal companies in the private, basically kind of like Pinkerton agencies of big coal, and 1 million rounds were fired on U.S. soil in 1921, and most people don't know about it. And they wore red bandanas around their necks, and that's one of the sources of the word redneck is from that. And there were left-wing counter-protesters at Charlottesville wearing red bandanas who were consciously bringing back that idea, right? And I just felt like, oh my gosh, like all these stories have been told, like here's the story to talk about, and here's history like rearing itself up again in this powerful way. And I couldn't make it book length because I had to get it all out then. And I basically spent all of September working on this one story that I think maybe in the future I could put into a whole novel length thing. But it just had to be, I had to get it out then, if that makes sense, you know?
Yeah.
And maybe that was more for a personal level and also because of what was going on in the world, you know? So I think we're probably,
Oh, we're done.
yeah, okay, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.